French seam is a great way to finish a seam while you sew. It's a very popular technique used when doing any kind of garment sewing because it allows you to actually have an enclosed finished seam while you're putting your piece together, so you don't actually have to go back and finish your seams when you're done. So from the right side, a French seam looks just like any other seam, but on the back you have a completely encased finished seam. Obviously this can be done on cotton. This is a great technique to use if you're maybe using like a silk or something lightweight or something that frays a lot and is really hard to work with. That way everything is encased and it is nice and looks good on the wrong side as well as the right side. So I'm going to show you how to do this, and I'm going to do this using a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Since this is the seam allowance that you will most likely have if you're doing garment sewing, especially if you're using a commercial pattern where that seam allowance is already built into, these are the measurements and the numbers you're going to want to use. This technique can be done on any seam allowance, so you can make those adjustments as necessary, but again, for 5/8 inch seam allowance, this is what you need to do. So what we need to start with is our fabric, 2 pieces. These are wrong sides together, and we are going to start by stitching a line of stitching that is 3/8 inch from the edge. Now if you are used to sewing, you can probably like eyeball a 5/8 inch seam allowance, or maybe if you've done a lot of quilting you can do a 1/4 inch. For me, 3/8 of an inch is just kind of a weird amount. I'm not used to that, so that's why I like to actually draw my line on there so I can follow it. I don't always know where that would be to line up on my throat plate, so I find just drawing my line is a little bit easier. So I have my pieces wrong sides together. Go ahead and put just a pin to hold them, and I am going to take this to the machine and I'm going to sew right along my line that I've drawn. Let's get my needle back to the middle. I had it moved over, and now we're ready to go. Okay. Go ahead and do a back stitch depending on what part this may be in your garment. It may or may not need one. I always think it's a good habit to do. That way you know everything is going to be nice and secure. Go ahead and do one at the back as well, and I can take this off. So now I have my fabric stitched at 3/8 of an inch. Now my next seam will be stitched at a 1/4 inch, so since that is smaller, I need to do some trimming. So I'm going to trim this down to right about 1/8 of an inch. Doesn't have to be perfect or straight, but you do need to trim off some of that fabric. And now I need to press. So what I'm going to do is actually just press this open to start, like so. And now we'll get to the part that you're actually used to doing with sewing, which is putting your fabric right sides together and stitching. So now I can fold this over. Now since I have 2 of the exact same size pieces, it's really easy to just line up all of my edges. But say you had maybe a side front and a front piece to a garment, you are going to want to just make sure you're folding right along this seam that you had here. And you can go ahead and give it a quick press to hold it, and then we'll put some pins in and we'll go over and stitch. So again, we had 3/8 to start with. Now we're going to do a 1/4, and that will give us the seam allowance that we want. Now again, you may know where 5/8 inch seam allowance is on your throat plate or your foot or however it is you line it up, and you just sort of know that, so it's easy to go over and stitch that. If you're not familiar with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, you can actually measure to make sure everything is lined up. So one way you could do that would be to take a ruler, and I'm going to line the edge of the ruler up with the edge of my foot right here, and then I've lowered my presser foot so it's holding my ruler in place. I can now adjust my needle position over until I'm lined up on top of that 1/4 inch line right here, and now I know I have an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. So that's one way that you can do that. Another way is maybe you're a quilter or your machine just came with a 1/4 inch quilting foot, but you can also attach that on here too, because you know that that foot is going to give you your accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. So whichever method you use, you want to make sure you just get to 1/4 inch, and now we're going to go ahead and stitch again. Go ahead and do a back stitch and then go all the way along the edge. Okay. A little back stitch at the end, and then we're done. Trim off our threads, and then we can open this up. Let's take out our pins. And you can see on the right side, I have my perfect seam, and on the wrong side, I have my seam allowance that's nice and encased, no raw edges, everything is finished. This technique is, again, great to use on garments and will make your garments look professionally finished. So it's definitely a technique that's an easy one to learn, a really quick one to be able to master, and something I think you should start using for all your sewing projects in the future.